As I've mentioned before, I grew up in southwestern Ohio, which is definitely corn and soybean country. I have happy memories of running through long rows of corn in the fields that surrounded my backyard. In the summertime, farmers would load their pickup trucks full of corn and they would park in town and sell to anyone who passed by. My dad and I bought dozens of ears of sweet corn all summer long, and that sweet corn was the Silver Queen variety, which remains my favorite sweet corn to this day. I don't see any truck beds filled with corn in southern Arizona, so I grow it in the garden myself. Not only is it the quintessential flavor of summertime, it also serves as a living trellis and as a shade plant for other plants in my garden. Just as with many other warm season varieties in southern Arizona, you get two opportunities to grow sweet corn: in early March when the soil begins to warm, and then again in mid-July through August during the monsoon season. Gardeners often get discouraged about growing corn in the garden. It just doesn't seem to turn out well. I know, I have had crops ruined by caterpillars. I've had scrawny ears with spotty kernels. I've had corn that tasseled out of time with ear development, which is called poor nick or missing the nick by corn farmers and can result in poor pollination or no pollination at all. It took me a few seasons to figure out how to grow a good ear of corn in Tucson, and I want to share that with you today. Summertime just would not be the same without sweet corn and popcorn and flour corn and all the corn. Make sure you stick around until the end because I've got some tips on getting great pollination, even if you're growing a small amount of corn, which is what most urban gardeners have to do because of space constraints. A teaser is that you can get a great ear of corn by hand pollinating yourself, and it is so easy. I like to amend my beds with organic compost twice a year, in the spring and in the fall. Most gardeners will only amend once a year, but since I'm growing so intensively, which means that I have a ton of stuff crammed into each bed, I like to do it twice a year. Corn is a hungry plant and will appreciate the extra nutrients. When the soil reaches 60 degrees Fahrenheit or above, you can plant out your corn seeds directly in the garden in the spring. Of course, you can start your seeds indoors a few weeks before. Many people say that corn does not transplant well, and it is true that corn does not like its roots disturbed. However, there are a couple ways around this. You can plant your seeds indoors in toilet paper tubes. Bonus is that they're free. Or you can use a product called root trainers, which gives more space for the corn root to develop and minimizes root disturbances when you transplant. You can do the same thing either starting your seeds indoors or directly sowing during monsoon season. When it comes time to directly sow your seeds outside or move your transplants outside, you need to space your rows 24 to 30 inches apart. Each seed or transplant needs to be 7 to 9 inches away from the other, and each seed needs to be planted at a 1-inch depth. Birds and other little rodents love to eat corn seedlings, so you can use a netting or a row cover or some kind of a cage to protect the little corn seedlings until they get big enough to survive the onslaught from above. You should try to plant your corn in blocks to ensure good pollination, and this is because corn is wind pollinated, and if you have it in densely packed areas, the pollen is more likely to contact the silks, which is how pollination happens. More about pollination coming up soon. A word of caution about planting different kinds of corn, like popcorn versus sweet corn versus flour corn. Because of the varying starch content of each of those types of corn, you don't want to plant them side by side together because they can cross-pollinate. And when they cross-pollinate, you're going to get a weird kernel that's not very tasty for anything. Corn needs the space of 800 feet or up to half a mile to avoid cross-pollination. Most of us gardeners don't have that much space. So to avoid this, you can actually still plant different types of corn if you stagger the time that you plant them in. And this is because that corn will then tassel at different times, and so the pollen will be released from each type of corn plant at different times, so you won't have to worry about the cross-pollination, even in a small space. Now, if you walk through my garden, you'll notice that some of my corn is planted in blocks, but a lot of it is planted in rows. So how is it that I just advised you to plant them in blocks, but I plant them in rows? Sometimes because of space constraints or other issues, like my desire to use corn as a support and shade plant, rows are necessary. But there is a way to increase pollination even under less than ideal circumstances. For example, if you're a small backyard gardener and you just have space for a few corn plants, you can still get a few good ears of corn off of them if you practice my pollination trick coming up. Corn is a very hungry plant, and it appreciates high nitrogen fertilizers at certain periods in its growth and development. You can side dress with an organic fertilizer high in nitrogen when the corn is about a foot tall, and again when you see tassel and silk development. When you look at the fertilizer bag, the nitrogen ratio is reflected in the first number. So you want a high first number and the other two numbers to be lower. For instance, if you saw a number that was like 47-0-0, that would reflect that it was a high nitrogen fertilizer. You could also see a number like 27-3-3. The 27 is the nitrogen number that you need to pay attention to, and since it's higher than the other two, that would be a good fertilizer to side dress your corn plants with at those times during development. When you apply that fertilizer, just mix it into the surface of the soil and water in well. Ideally, your corn will be growing happily, and as you're wandering through the garden, you may see that they're bushing out or creating side shoots, and that's actually a really good sign. These side shoots are called tillers or suckers, and they reflect that the corn is happy because it has ideal growing conditions. You don't need to remove these suckers. Tillers or suckers can also develop when your corn stalk is damaged and the plant tries to regrow itself. You may be wondering, when is the perfect time to harvest your sweet corn? Your sweet corn is going to be ready to harvest 17 to 24 days after you see the first silk formation. When you look at the sweet corn ear, you're going to see that the husk is still green and fresh looking. The silks may be easy to pull away from the end of the ear, and they'll also be dry and brown. That's when you know that it's ready to harvest, but pay attention to the number of days from first silk formation until when you see the silks start to dry. It should be around 17 to 24 days. As I mentioned before, with popcorn, dent corn, flower corn, flint corn, all of those types of varieties, you need to wait and let the ears mature on the plant until they are dry. What you're looking for is a husk that is dry and brown and kind of papery. You want the silks to also be very dry, and then you can remove them from the plant. All right, let's talk about corn pollination. Utah State University recommends that you plant 3 or more rows in your block of corn. Now, if you're gardening in a small space, that may not be an option. The solution is to hand pollinate. In order to talk about hand pollinating corn, we need to have a little corn anatomy class first. Corn is a monoecious plant, which means that it has both male and female flowers on the same plant, but separately. The tassel is the male flower, and if you look at the tassel, you may see these little dangly bits, and those are the anthers, and the anthers release pollen, which is the male sex cell that can pollinate the female flower. The ear of corn is the female flower, and each silk is attached to an individual ovule, which will become a kernel if pollinated. Have you ever harvested an ear of corn and you've got missing kernels? Well, that's because each of those silks that were attached to those did not get pollinated properly, and so only the ones that were pollinated developed into kernels. Pollination occurs when pollen falls on those exposed silks and then travels down each one of those silks to the waiting, immature kernel below. When the wind blows, the pollen will float on the breeze and hopefully fall on the awaiting tassels below. This is why the emergence of the tassels and the silks need to be timed perfectly, because if you have tassels that are releasing pollen and no silk for the pollen to land on, then you're going to miss the nick. For small space gardeners, the solution is hand pollination, and I'm going to talk about 3 different ways that you can hand pollinate your corn. You need to do this very soon after silk emergence. The silks should look yellow and fresh, not dry and brown. The first way that you can hand pollinate corn is very simple. You grab the stalk and you shake it, and hopefully all of those pollen granules will fall down on the silk below. The second way that you can hand pollinate corn is to simply cut off part of the tassel or even the whole tassel, and then you can rub that tassel onto the silks below. This is going to coat those silks with pollen. The third way is my favorite way, and I'm going to take you step by step through it. First, you're going to get a paper bag. Then you're going to gently bend each of the tassels into the bag and shake it to release those pollen grains. I like to walk around my entire corn bed and do all of them at once so that I can collect all of that pollen at the same time. If you look in the bag, you're going to see a mix of anthers that have fallen off as well as the pollen. To make it easier to apply this pollen to each one of your corn ears, I suggest that you get a sieve and you sift out the anthers from the pollen. I do this a little bit at a time because the sieve that I'm using is pretty small, and so what I'll do is I'll pour a little bit in and I will shake it, and I will make sure that all I have left in that is the anthers, which I'll then dump into the compost pile. Once I've separated out the pollen, I will set that aside and go back to my corn plants. With a sterilized pair of scissors, I will give each one of those corn ears a little haircut. I cut the silks down so that there are only an inch or two left rather than having them just hang right over the ear. And the reason that I do this is because it's much easier to get an even application of the pollen on each one of those silks if they're not so long and flopped over. Now I'm ready to go get my container of pollen. I slowly shake out a little bit of pollen onto each one of the ears of corn. Then I gently spread it over the silks so that I'm getting an even application of the pollen and hopefully good contact with each one of those silks, because remember, that pollen needs to travel down each one of those silks to get good pollination. And after that, you simply wait for the harvest. I've been doing this hand pollinating technique for several seasons and it works really well. For each of these three techniques, you need to wait until later in the morning, until after the dew dries, so that you can shake and separate the pollen from the anthers when it's not wet. All right, so now you've done all of this work to plant your seeds and raise your corn and hand pollinate. It would be such a shame if a pest came along and ruined your harvest after all of that effort. I want to talk to you about two pests that are pretty common in southern Arizona. The corn earworm and the corn borer are caterpillars that can decimate your harvest. To prevent caterpillars, you can use a product called BT, which stands for Bacillus thuringiensis. BT is a species of bacteria that can produce a harmful protein to certain insects. You can apply BT when you see caterpillars present, or you can apply it every 2 to 3 weeks as a precaution. Okay, I think you should be fully prepared to go forth and farm all the corn. Thank you so much for sticking around for all this corny talk. Until next time, happy gardening.